The last thing she said before lifting the glass was, "Standards matter." A second later, red wine was running down the front of my suit in the middle of a crowded investor gala. No one moved, not her brother, not the board members standing beside us, not the investors who had been smiling seconds earlier. Several phones were already recording. Moments like that can turn chaotic very quickly if you respond the wrong way. Arguments create noise. Noise creates ambiguity, and ambiguity is the one thing contracts are designed to eliminate. So I didn't argue. Instead, I stepped away. Within minutes, the escrow agent acknowledged my instruction timestamped, logged, and circulated as an administrative hold, 6 hours earlier. None of that seemed possible. My name is Helen Whitaker. I'm 58 years old, and I serve as Chief Risk and Integration Signatory for a private equity firm based in Chicago. Before I continue, a brief note for viewers. This story is an original fictional narrative created by the authors of the Hear Fear channel. It's inspired by the hidden dynamics of workplace power and corporate decision-making, and it is shared with the intention of encouraging reflection, empathy, and understanding. Now, back to that evening. The acquisition we were closing that week had been in negotiation for nearly 11 months. The purchase price was $2.4 billion, already wired into escrow at First Dominion Bank on LaSalle Street. At that stage in a transaction, things are rarely dramatic. The real work is procedural. You verify the final documents, you confirm the representations, and once the final conditions are satisfied, the funds move. There were 3 remaining conditions that night. I held one of them. The gala had been scheduled as a pre-closing event, part celebration, part strategy. Investors were present, along with senior management and members of the board. Corinne Halstead, the chief executive's sister, attended in her role as board observer and chair of the company's Strategic Image Committee. She did not have an operational title, but her influence wasn't symbolic. Her name appeared in governance disclosures. She represented the company publicly. And when people like that appear in official filings, their behavior carries legal weight, whether they realize it or not. Earlier that evening, she had already tested the boundaries. Twice she referred to me as part of the integration support team. That wasn't my title. I let it pass. Correcting someone publicly can escalate situations that are better documented quietly. Then the wine happened. When the glass tilted, several phones were already recording. I felt the fabric of my suit grow heavy and cold against my collar. No one stepped in immediately, not even her brother. That pause told me more than anything she said. I walked out into the hallway, opened my phone, and called escrow control. "Please file notice under section 12.4. I said, "Initiate an administrative hold pending review." There was a brief silence on the other end. "Are you certain?" the officer asked. I hesitated for a moment. Then I confirmed. Less than 5 minutes later, the acknowledgement appeared in my inbox. Administrative hold initiated. Escrow release suspended. Inside the ballroom, they were still pretending the evening was intact. Outside, the clock had started. The hold was temporary, but it shifted the balance in a way I understood clearly, even if they did not yet. That was the moment the deal stopped being inevitable and started becoming uncertain. 6 hours before the wine, I was sitting in a small conference room on the 12th floor of our office on LaSalle Street. Reviewing the final escrow summary, $2.4 billion had already been wired into First Dominion Bank that morning. At that stage of a transaction, nothing dramatic is supposed to happen. Negotiations are finished. Due diligence is complete. Valuations have been argued over for months. All that remains is release. Only 3 conditions were left. I was responsible for one of them. Martin Kessler, our general counsel, stood near the whiteboard holding a printed checklist. Martin believed in clarity. He rarely spoke more than necessary. "Integration risk certification," he said, tapping the page. "That's yours?" "I know," I replied. "Governance representation letter from their side, us. We've received a draft." "And the third," I said, already aware. "No material reputational event prior to release?" He looked at me carefully when he said it, not suspiciously, just making sure the weight of the words landed where they should. "It's standard language," I told him. "Section 12.4. A 72-hour administrative hold can be triggered if an authorized signatory reports a potential reputational event under the agreement. And you're the authorized signatory," he said. "I am." Martin lowered the checklist. "Once you certify, the funds move. $2.4 billion clears escrow. After that, Reversing anything means litigation. I understand. He studied me for a moment. This isn't symbolic authority. Helen, you're not there tonight for optics. I'm aware of that too. That seemed to satisfy him. He nodded once and left the room. I stayed behind with the documents. Not because I doubted our team, but because I've learned something over the years. Clarity comes from reading the same sentence more than once. The clause was simple. If a governance influencer engaged in conduct that created credible reputational exposure before the release of funds, Escrow could initiate a temporary administrative hold while the investment committee reviewed the situation. A governance influencer. That phrase had taken 2 full days to negotiate. Corinne Halstead's name appeared in the company's governance disclosures as board observer and chair of the Strategic Image Committee. She owned 11% equity through the Halstead Family Trust. She appeared at investor events and represented the company publicly. Legally speaking, she qualified. At the time, the clause felt theoretical. These provisions exist to protect against fraud, regulatory action, or executive misconduct. They aren't written for hurt feelings. They exist for investor-facing behavior that might cause lenders or counterparties to reconsider risk while billions of dollars are still waiting to move. Over the years, I had signed dozens of agreements with language like that. I had never expected to use it. Later that afternoon, the chief executive, Daniel Halstead, called me directly. "Everything ready on your end?" he asked. "It is. We're waiting on your governance letter. You'll have it before 7. And the release schedule. If nothing changes," he said, "funds clear tomorrow at 9 a.m. If nothing changes, his voice carried the confidence of someone who believed the hardest part was already behind him. The acquisition would stabilize their logistics network across the Midwest. It would raise their valuation, calm activist investors, and strengthen Daniel's control over the company. "I'll see you tonight," he said. "I'll be there." When the call ended, I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair. Deals at this stage don't feel emotional. They feel heavy. 11 months of negotiations, diligence, legal drafting, and investor calls eventually narrow down to a few final confirmations. A signature, a handshake, a scheduled release. For a moment, I remember thinking how uneventful the evening would probably be. A photograph, polite speeches, a confirmation email the next morning. Then I would close the file and move on to the next transaction. I don't usually expect disruption. I prepare for it, but I don't expect it. By the time I left the office for the gala, everything was in place. The money was waiting, the contract language was clear, and my authority was written into the agreement not based on personality, reputation, or who spoke the loudest in the room. Inside the ballroom later that night, none of them seemed concerned about clauses or escrow mechanics. They were focused on introductions, positioning, and appearances. I was focused on the 3 conditions. Only one of them depended on me. And one of them, though, no one realized it yet, depended entirely on her. Corinne Halstead didn't hold an executive title, but she didn't need one. In practical terms, she moved through the company as if authority naturally followed her. Her name appeared clearly in the governance disclosures we reviewed during diligence. Board observer, chair of the Strategic Image Committee, 11% equity through the Halstead Family Trust, public representative at investor events. Those descriptions weren't decorative, they carried legal meaning. Anyone appearing in governance disclosures becomes part of the company's public structure. Their behavior reflects on the organization whether they intend it to or not. I had met Corinne twice before the gala. The first meeting was in our office during a diligence session. "So, you're the integration lead," she said, scanning my credentials as though she were grading them. "I oversee risk certification for the fund," I clarified. She smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That sounds administrative." "It isn't." Daniel stepped in gently. "Corinne, Helen signs the final release." Her eyes shifted toward me then. "Ah," she said softly. "So you're the gatekeeper?" The word lingered in the room longer than it should have. The second meeting took place on a conference call about post-closing communications. "We control the narrative after closing," she said firmly. "I'll be handling investor visibility. Our fund controls the timing of capital release." I replied. The silence that followed was brief but noticeable. In Chicago's private equity circles, Corinne's reputation wasn't exactly a mystery. I had heard about 2 human resources settlements tied loosely to her involvement. There had also been a public relations issue the year before that was quietly resolved. Nothing criminal, nothing regulatory, just a pattern. The kind of pattern that stays manageable until it doesn't. I didn't judge her for confidence. Confidence isn't a liability, but influence without boundaries can become unstable. And instability in a transaction of this size isn't theoretical, it affects capital. Standing in the ballroom that night, watching Corinne move easily between investors as though she owned the room, I realized something I hadn't fully admitted before. She didn't see herself as adjacent to power. She believed she was above it, before the wine. There were smaller moments, the kind that often go unnoticed unless you're paying attention. I was standing near the investor table when Corinne approached with two board members following behind her. "This is Helen," Daniel began, gesturing toward me. "She's leading our integration assistant," Corinne interrupted smoothly. "She's been coordinating logistics." I looked at Daniel. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second, long enough for me to notice. "I oversee risk certification for the fund," I corrected calmly. Corinne tilted her head slightly. "Of course. Titles get so complicated during transactions." The board members nodded politely and drifted away. A few minutes later, a server passed our table and accidentally spilled a small amount of water near the edge. Corinne glanced in my direction. "Could you grab some napkins?" she asked. She didn't quite look at me when she said it. "I'm not staff," I replied quietly. She smiled. "Everyone contributes tonight." Daniel shifted beside her but said nothing. Later, when several limited partners approached, Corinne leaned toward me again. "We'll need someone to coordinate seating adjustments," she said. "You're good with details?" "I'm responsible for release authority," I reminded her. She held my gaze for a moment. "Yes," she said slowly. "About that." The pause that followed carried more meaning than the sentence itself. I've spent enough years in corporate rooms to recognize the pattern. Authority is rarely challenged immediately. First, it's tested. A small correction here, a subtle dismissal there, a comment framed as politeness. If you react too quickly, you're labeled emotional. If you stay quiet, people assume you can be ignored. I chose composure. The funds were still in escrow. My role wasn't defined by how someone introduced me in a ballroom. It was defined by contract language signed months earlier. Corinne didn't realize something important. Every small moment that evening was quietly creating a record of its own. The moment didn't begin loudly. It began with proximity. Corinne moved toward me while two limited partners stood nearby. Daniel was beside her, mid-conversation, but she stepped slightly ahead of him as if the floor already belonged to her. "I've been meaning to clarify something," she said, her tone smooth enough that people nearby leaned in instead of stepping away. "When exactly are you planning to release funds tomorrow morning?" I replied. "Assuming all conditions are satisfied?" She held a wine glass loosely between her fingers. "Assuming? That's how contracts work." A faint smile appeared. "You do understand how significant this acquisition is for us." "I do. And you understand that delays would be unfortunate if there's no material issue." I said calmly, "There won't be a delay." She stepped closer. "You keep emphasizing that word, material. It's defined in the agreement." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Sometimes discretion matters more than definitions." "Definitions protect discretion," I replied. For a moment, neither of us moved. I could feel the fabric of my suit against my collar. Warm from the room, someone shifted behind her. I noticed two phones angled toward us. Corinne lifted her glass. "You're very confident," she said quietly. "For someone without equity." "I don't need equity," I answered, "to execute authority." That was when she smiled fully. "Standards matter," she said, loud enough now for the nearby table to hear. Then she tilted the glass. The wine moved slowly at first, then steadily. Down the front of my suit, I felt the liquid soak into the fabric, cool against my skin. Somewhere behind her, someone let out a short laugh. Daniel didn't speak, not immediately, for 3 full seconds. No one intervened. Corinne lowered the empty glass and placed it carefully on the table. "Perhaps now we're aligned," she added. I didn't reach for a napkin. I didn't respond to the comment. Instead, I looked at her, not with anger, with assessment. The phrase she had used, the witnesses standing nearby, the phones recording the moment. Daniel finally stepped forward. "Corinne, that's enough." She shrugged lightly. "It was an accident." "It wasn't," I said evenly. Our eyes met. For the first time that evening, I saw a flicker of uncertainty cross her expression, but it passed quickly. I turned and walked away. Staying would have changed the moment from documentation to confrontation. Behind me, The ballroom slowly resumed its conversation, strained but functional. They were already reframing what had happened. For me, the moment had changed categories. It wasn't personal humiliation anymore. It was actionable conduct tied to governance influence. By the time I reached the elevator lobby, my phone was already in my hand. The hallway outside the ballroom was quiet in a way the main room wasn't. Through the doors, I could still hear muffled conversation and the distant sound of glasses being set on tables. I looked down once at the wine soaking into my suit, brushed the fabric lightly, and opened my phone. Then I called First Dominion Bank's escrow control desk. Escrow operations. A man answered. This is Helen Whitaker. I said, transaction reference 7391. I need to file notice under section 12.4. Initiate an administrative hold. There was a short pause while he pulled up the file. I could hear the sound of keyboard strokes. Ms. Whitaker, he said carefully. Filing that notice triggers a 72-hour hold automatically. Are you certain you want to proceed? Yes. Do you have a basis for material reputational exposure involving a governance influencer? I do. Another brief pause. Understood. Please confirm this is a formal instruction. This is formal instruction. Processing now. I leaned lightly against the wall. Once the authorization entered their system, the rest would happen automatically. It's entered, he said a moment later. Administrative hold is active as of this timestamp. Notifications will issue within seconds. Thank you. I ended the call before I had time to reconsider. Almost immediately, my phone vibrated. The notice had been distributed automatically to our counsel, the seller's counsel, and the designated executive contacts listed in the escrow schedule. Daniel Halstead was one of them. The message on my screen was short and precise. Administrative hold initiated. Escrow release suspended. Inside the ballroom, they were still managing appearances. Out here, the clock had started. My phone rang less than a minute later. Daniel. What did you just do? He asked. He wasn't shouting, but the calm in his voice had disappeared. I filed notice under the agreement. For what reason? Material reputational exposure involving your sister. He exhaled sharply. Helen. That was a social incident. It involved a disclosed governance influencer in front of investors. You could have spoken to me first. I did, I said quietly. She chose to escalate. The silence that followed wasn't anger. It was calculation. You've put $2.4 billion at risk, he said finally. No, I replied. I've placed it under review. The hold could have remained procedural. It didn't, less than an hour after I returned home. My phone began lighting up again. Martin forwarded me a screenshot. Corinne had posted a photo from the gala. There was no image of me, just a caption. Standards matter. Anyone outside the room would have thought it was harmless, but anyone who had been there understood exactly what she was referencing. Daniel called shortly afterward. His voice was controlled, but thinner than before. She's refusing to take it down. That complicates the review. I said, she believes you overstepped. I acted under the agreement. She thinks you're weaponizing the clause. I documented conduct tied to governance influence. I replied calmly, that's not personal. He didn't argue. That silence told me he understood more than he was willing to say. The next escalation came the following morning. Martin walked into my office without knocking, holding a printed letter. You've received a cease and desist, he said. On what grounds? Alleged breach of fiduciary duty. She claims you initiated the hold in bad faith to pressure equity restructuring. I took the letter and read it once. The tone was aggressive, but it wasn't strategic. That won't hold, I said. It's not meant to. Martin replied, it's meant to intimidate. Before we could discuss it further, my phone rang again. Escrow control, Miss Whitaker. The officer said, we've logged a call from Ms. Halstead requesting immediate release of funds. She doesn't have release authority. We're aware. The request was denied. We documented the attempt and notified counsel. That single action changed the situation. It was no longer just reputational exposure. Now there was a documented attempt to interfere in a controlled financial process. By mid-afternoon, 2 of our limited partners contacted the firm requesting clarification about governance stability at the company. The conversation had moved beyond a glass of wine. Now it was about structural reliability. Whether the counterparty on a $2.4 billion transaction could be trusted to respect the rules governing the deal. Corinne had tried to force the system. Instead, she had expanded the review. The 72-hour hold turned into 3 weeks of review. External counsel presented their findings during a closed session with our investment committee. I attended to answer procedural questions. not to advocate for a particular outcome. The lead attorney spoke first. Estimated discrimination litigation exposure ranges between $150 and $180 million, and he said that assumes no regulatory escalation. Daniel shifted in his chair. That's speculative. It's modeled, the attorney replied calmly, based on comparable cases. Another advisor added, directors and officers' insurance premiums would likely increase significantly at renewal, possibly double. And the ESG rating impact, one of our partners asked. Likely a downgrade. The consultant answered, two limited partners have already indicated they would reassess capital commitments if governance instability persists. I limited my comments to documentation. The escrow interference attempt is logged, I said. That elevates counterparty risk beyond optics. Internal audit then confirmed something else. Two prior settlements tied to Corinne's involvement. They weren't public, but they weren't immaterial either. Daniel looked toward me at one point. This wasn't criminal conduct. No, I said, it was repeated exposure. By the end of the session, the narrative had shifted. This wasn't about a single night at a gala anymore. It was about patterns, oversight, and whether leadership had the discipline to prevent risk before it reached the point where capital had to react. A vote was scheduled. The preliminary count leaned 5-4 in favor of proceeding with the acquisition if corrective measures were implemented. The margin was far thinner than anyone had expected. The final meeting took place in our main conference room. No press, no outside advisors beyond counsel, just the investment committee, Daniel Halstead, and a quiet table that now carried the weight of 11 months of negotiations. I was there to answer risk questions, not to argue for an outcome. Daniel began speaking before anyone prompted him. Corinne will resign immediately from her position as board observer, he said. Her 11% equity will be diluted under an emergency restructuring plan. We will appoint independent governance oversight within 30 days. One of our senior partners leaned forward slightly. Public acknowledgement. A formal apology has been drafted, Daniel replied. It will be issued before market open tomorrow. Another committee member spoke calmly. Why wasn't this addressed after the prior incidents? Daniel paused. Because we believed they were isolated. They weren't, I said quietly, not as an accusation, as a fact. For a moment, it seemed possible the concessions might be enough. The preliminary vote count had been 5-4 in favor of proceeding if the corrective measures were immediate and verifiable. Then escrow counsel joined the call. We need to disclose additional information, he said. The room went still. Ms. Halstead contacted escrow operations directly requesting immediate release of funds despite lacking authority. The call was recorded and logged. That changed the tone instantly. This was no longer reputational exposure. It was procedural interference in a controlled financial process. One partner closed his folder slowly. That changes the liability modeling. Another nodded. It suggests the governance instability hasn't actually been contained. The chair of the committee looked around the table. Then he called the vote. 7-2. Termination approved. Within 48 hours, the $2.4 billion acquisition transferred to a competing bidder. When the meeting ended, Daniel remained seated. He looked older than he had 3 weeks earlier. Was there anything I could have done, he asked. I thought about the question for a moment before answering. You didn't lose the deal when she poured the wine. I told him. You lost it when no one stopped her before the formal notices were issued within days. Corinne Halstead was removed as board observer effective immediately. Her 11% equity stake was diluted under the emergency restructuring plan approved by the board. She was barred from representing the company publicly and stepped down from 3 nonprofit boards where she had previously served as a keynote presence. Daniel retained his title as chief executive, but independent oversight was installed above several strategic decisions. One of our senior partners told him directly during the transition meeting, control without accountability is what cost you $2.4 billion. Daniel didn't argue. The company survived, but its valuation premium narrowed. And in Chicago's financial community, everyone understood what that meant. Survival is not the same as strength. A week later, my managing partner asked me to stop by his office. You handled this correctly, and he said, we'd like to begin your partnership track. I did my job? I replied, that's exactly the point. My suit eventually came back from the cleaners without a stain. The record didn't. What I took from the experience wasn't about clauses or contracts, but it was about boundaries. Authority means very little if you hesitate to use it when standards are broken. Silence protects comfort. It rarely protects stability. If this story resonated with you, take a moment to like, comment, or share it with someone navigating power and pressure in their own professional life. The people in that ballroom believed power meant humiliation, but in finance, power means something else entirely. It means never allowing yourself to become the risk. Before we close this story, there's a quiet lesson here that goes beyond boardrooms and billion-dollar deals. In everyday life, most conflicts don't begin with major decisions. They begin with small moments, how someone treats another person, how others respond, and whether anyone is willing to set a boundary when something clearly crosses the line. Respect isn't just a social courtesy, it's a signal of stability. In families, workplaces, and communities, people reveal who they are in the moments they believe don't matter. And silence, especially from people who have the authority to act, can sometimes carry the biggest consequences. If this story gave you something to think about, feel free to share your perspective below. Your experiences and reflections often add the most meaningful part to conversations like this.